Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
It was a London derby at Stamford Bridge when Potter's Chelsea hosted Arteta's Arsenal. In the end, Arsenal had a dominant performance despite only scoring one goal through Gabriel. The XG showed that Arsenal had by far the better quality opportunities. But what tactics did Potter and Arteta use? Let's take a look. And for those of you asking in the comments, the software I use to analyze is called Once Video Analyzer Pro. And it's already pretty affordable, but with my link down in the description, you can get an extra 10% off. Now let's first look at Arsenal in possession. For the most part, Arsenal would build with just the two centre-backs, as Chelsea were only pressing with Aubameyang, so the 2 versus 1 would already give them the advantage. Occasionally, if Havertz did look to join in the press to create a 2 versus 2, Ben White could drop in temporarily to be the third centre-back, thus allowing them to still have the advantage. For the most part, however, Havertz tended to stay deeper, so the back 2 was plenty. And Arsenal built up with their usual midfield structure, with Partey being the sole pivot, whilst Odegaard and Xhaka were expected to push much higher up the pitch. And in this 4-2-3-1 structure, Chelsea and Havertz in particular were perfectly positioned to make midfield progression much more difficult, as he was assigned with essentially, at times, man-marking Partey, making this initial play much more difficult for Arsenal. So as you can see, Partey tended to be the sole pivot, with Odegaard and Xhaka much higher out of shot. So this scenario became quite a common occurrence, with Havertz looking to be as close to Partey as possible. And Arsenal's fullbacks had slightly different functions. Zinchenko was much more likely to invert alongside Partey to be the second outlet, making it much more difficult for Havertz to close down one man. Ben White on the other hand was more adaptable, as he could drop deep to be the third centre-back at times. Occasionally, he would invert into the midfield so that they had a 3, or he could take up more traditional fullback positions. But Chelsea wanted to make it difficult for Arsenal to progress easily through the midfield. This meant that their wingers in Sterling and Mount were highly responsive to the movements of the fullbacks. So in situations such as this, which were more common with Zinchenko infield, Sterling tended to be drawn quite central. And this would of course create a gaping hole in this left-hand side for Arsenal. Havertz is looking to pick up Partey as always, while Zinchenko's positioning means that Sterling has come in from wider in order to be able to close him down. As a result, there's a lot more space in this wide left position. So this positioning meant that Arsenal only played through the centre 25% of the time. Arsenal would take advantage of the space down the left-hand side in different ways. Firstly, Gabriel as the left centre-back could push much higher up. However, his passing range is not the most penetrative, so he couldn't easily find line-breaking passes. Alternatively, Xhaka from this higher position could look to drop in order to have a little bit more time on the ball to then look for men who are higher up the pitch. But perhaps Arteta's chief strategy was his use of Gabriel Jesus in these situations. Even by his standards, Jesus was dropping extremely deep throughout the 90, and this could be into the midfield, but more interestingly, we saw him take up these left-back positions at times, and this would help Arsenal to begin to create an overload on the left-hand side. Sterling, once again, is more narrow than a traditional winger, so that he can look after Zinchenko. And here we see Gabriel Jesus is beginning to drop into this space vacated by Zinchenko. So this means that Arsenal now have quite a few numbers in this left-hand side. Potter adapted to this instantly. When Jesus was dropping from centre forward, Chalobah would look to almost man-mark him, dropping with Jesus no matter how deep he went. But the problem becomes apparent as it leaves a gaping hole in defence, and Xhaka from this high left-hand side could push much higher up, alongside Martinelli, and we saw a lot of Arsenal looking to get the long ball over into that gap when Chalobah had dropped deeper with Jesus. Jesus has dropped deep once again, and Chalobah has come all the way with him. And already, Gabriel is looking to complete the long pass over the top. Both Xhaka and Martinelli are making the runs into that hole vacated by Chalobah. But as Potter was apparently desperate to stop Jesus receiving in these deep regions, one way that he did adapt was by getting Azpilicueta to drop deeper, so that in these situations they had a makeshift back 3. But the problem with this, of course, is that now Martinelli had a little bit more room in which to receive out on the left-hand side, then have a run at the defender potentially. Jesus' depth has once again drawn Chalobah higher up the pitch. And there's a bit of rotation in this situation, as it's Zinchenko who's maintaining the width, whilst Martinelli is beginning to move central. But the principle is similar, as Azpilicueta has tucked in order to create that makeshift 3. So Zinchenko, in the original Martinelli position, now has a little bit more room in which to receive potentially. And when Xhaka receives, again drawing Chalobah even higher, Zinchenko now has room out wide. And even when Jesus started higher up the pitch, Arsenal still had success down this left-hand side. This is because, of course, Xhaka tended to push extremely high up into the half space, which would draw Azpilicueta much more narrow, and he constantly had to decide which man to pick up, especially when Sterling had been drawn in narrow. What this tended to lead to was Martinelli receiving slightly deeper, and by the time Azpilicueta came out to close him down, he had a bit more of a running start and could look to attack the byline, or cut in and have a cross. Sterling is central on Zinchenko, whilst Xhaka has pushed much higher up, meaning that Azpilicueta has to worry about Martinelli as well as Xhaka. So there is the potential for a wide ball out to Martinelli, who can then look to attack the byline. Now let's look at Chelsea in possession. When Mendy had the ball in deeper regions, both Chalobah and Silva tended to drop alongside him in order to offer him an easier option, which is quite useful as he's not as good on the ball as Kepa, so the ball playing centre backs, Silva in particular, will be able to begin the play. And Arsenal did at times look to press high up, and the main role of Jesus is that once the ball became live, he would look to cut off the lateral passing lane, forcing Chelsea to play down one half of the pitch. And interestingly, what we would see, both from goal kicks as well as open play at times, is that initially Saka would be more narrow on one of the pivots, due to the positioning of Mount, which we'll discuss as we go forward. But this would bait Chelsea into playing into the fullback, where Saka could then spring forward, and Arsenal would cut off the easy interior options, thus looking to force Chelsea long, although we did at times see Chelsea still able to play through. So initially Jesus is the sole presser, and the ball is coming out towards Thiago Silva. And once it does, Jesus is looking to cut off the angle back to Chalobah or to Mendy, forcing Silva to play forward hopefully. And initially Saka would take up these much more central regions, meaning that Cucurella was the obvious man in space. Once the ball did go wide, Saka would then look to press, and as we can see, Arsenal are cutting off the easy options inside. But in this case, Mount has tucked in, so Chelsea are still able to play out. But, as we know, Potter is more of a possession-oriented manager. However, due to Kepa's injury, as well as anticipating the high press from Arsenal, Potter opted to go long much more often than usual, meaning that despite having less possession, they played many more long balls than Arsenal, as they instead looked to go over the press, and they were strategic with how they went long. 3 of the back 4 are centre-backs, who naturally have more height and tend to be better in the air. So Zinchenko was more of a weak spot. This, paired with somebody as tall as Loftus-Cheek in the midfield, as well as Havertz, meant that Chelsea tended to overload this side of the pitch and then look to go long to these men. Gabriel, however, as well as Xhaka, who was disciplined in dropping in, were also fairly formidable in the air in this match. And in open play, today Arsenal did tend to defend in much more of a 4-1-4-1, as opposed to the makeshift front two that they usually have with either Saka or Martinelli joining Jesus. And a major goal for Chelsea was looking to create overloads in the midfield region, primarily through Mount, who would drop in so that they almost had a midfield box. So this was the shape that we did see at times, with a double pivot of Jorginho and Loftus-Cheek deeper, whilst Mason Mount had come in off the left-hand side and Havertz dropping in from attacking midfield. However, in this match, Cucurella was not so great at providing the width when Mount had gone in more narrow. So, an advantage that Arsenal did gain by not using the front two press with a winger coming in narrow, or sometimes as we see, switching to a 4-4-2 with Odegaard joining, which would have meant that they were highly overloaded in the midfield. Instead, the 4-1-4-1 meant that Partey would be deep, and Xhaka and Odegaard could look to press both of the pivots. And in this match, neither Jorginho or Loftus-Cheek were at their best, so under this pressure they didn't fare too well, meaning that despite having 2 men behind the lines, of which Partey could look to patrol them, Chelsea for the most part found it difficult to find their men between the lines. But one area that at times toothless attack of Chelsea did have success is taking advantage of Zinchenko's positioning for Arsenal, both when defending as well as in the transition when Arsenal did have the ball. When defending, Zinchenko tended to be aggressive in the press, particularly when Martinelli had been drawn higher up the pitch in a press. So his positioning there could mean that Sterling would have some space out wide. Alternatively, as we saw in the previous video, when Arsenal were in possession, he tended to take up this more inside position. Either way, the result was the same, with Sterling having space in behind Zinchenko. So as a result, when Chelsea were able to find Sterling, either directly long or through some midfield play, it would force Gabriel to come across, and Havertz from the more attacking midfield position, especially with Xhaka and Odegaard being higher both in and out of possession, would then be able to make the run in behind Gabriel. And on a couple of occasions we saw Havertz in this highly promising position, but he just couldn't make the most of it. So here we see that Martinelli has been drawn higher up the pitch due to Chelsea using this modified back three. So Mendy is able to find Sterling, and Zinchenko had been higher up looking to back up the press. And as you can see, Odegaard and Xhaka tended to be higher, so there's a little bit more potential room for Havertz from attacking midfield. Gabriel has gone across to deal with Sterling, and Havertz can make the run into the space created, meaning that Havertz gets into this great position but is unable to find a decisive pass. In this scenario, Arsenal were in possession, and as you can see, Zinchenko is higher up the pitch. Once again, the Arsenal attacking shape calls for both Xhaka and Odegaard to be fairly high up the pitch, so when there's a transition, Chelsea have space to exploit. So Sterling was usually on the front foot, looking to make the run in behind. And once again, Gabriel has to go out to him, and Havertz has a little bit more space in attacking midfield. He is then found, and Aubameyang and Mount are once again his two supporting players, but he's unable to find either of them. And once again, at times, we could see it be Sterling instead, who directly looked to make the run in behind, were just not potent enough during this match. Overall, this was a mature performance from Arsenal, controlled in every phase, and once again showing that this is a genuine title challenge. For the tactical score, Arteta earns a high 8, managing to suffocate Potter in most phases, who only earns a 5 for the lack of offensive threat, but was not overly poor. But what are your ratings? Drop them down below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out. But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.